All right, it didn't.
Yeah,
all
it's
right.
recording.
Now I'm recording. Okay, we're good. Okay, is it time to go?
Maybe you need JB's approval.
Yeah, well, I guess her connection's a little, it's 5 after now. Why don't we get started? This will be just a little bit different. I guess for me, this was a little bit different topic than soils, which is about sort of natural bodies. You can go out and dig them up out of the ground and look at them and talk about them and think about where they came from. And this is more about a process, more about human relationships with this process over long periods of time, how it's affected a landscape in the past and today. So it's a little bit different. It will unfold slightly differently than some of the others. And if you've tuned into any of our previous webinars, you know I have a sort of habit. It's a habit I've gotten into as an ecologist, to always remind myself, whatever topic I'm working on, I call it breadth and integration. It's to look broadly at many sources of information, to try to integrate them together to see where they agree or disagree with one another. So in order to understand, in the case of fire, to understand relationships between people and fire in the Chicago region, we're going to look at relationships all over the world. In order to understand landscapes in the Chicago area and their relationship to fire, we're going to look at landscapes all over North America. And I'll both criticize models, especially some very large-scale models in the history of plant ecology, but I'll also use some smaller scale models of my own in trying to understand fire and landscapes and those relationships. And we'll take a very long view of history, but we'll also come right up to the present and see how the relationship between people and fire plays itself out today in the practice of prescribed burning. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today. And I want to start this presentation with a cultural use of fire for a very important reason, because I think it leads to some of the most important questions in conservation today. And we'll get to those questions in just a second. But fire, to me, is an entry point into those questions. So we're going to look at a very old relationship between people and fire. I remember a day almost 30 years ago, I was working and teaching at the Morton Arboretum. And I don't remember the title of the class. I can remember the classroom I was in. I can remember the color of the desks. And I can remember I was talking about the role of fire and the role fire played in landscapes of northeastern Illinois prior to European American settlement. And in particular, I was addressing the role of Native peoples here in setting many or most of those fires. And I said, and this is not an exact quote because I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something very close to this. I said that the vegetation of our area would have been fundamentally different, probably a deciduous forest of some sort or other, had there been no human occupants. And right at that moment, there was a woman in the front row, just to my left, and the expression on her face was a mixture of sadness, hurt, confusion, and anger, which isn't the usual response I get when I'm teaching. They nod off and their head hits the table, but they don't get angry at me. I sort of paused inside for a moment, seeing that, and then I realized what I had done. I'd taken something very important away from her. What I'd taken away from her was the nature she had grown up with, the sublime nature, the pristine nature that we all grew up with as children. We have a very dualistic vision of nature in our society. Nature is the tornado, it's the hurricane, it's the flood, it's the forest fire that rage on television as we watch them and people are fighting them. It's that side of nature. And then there's this pristine, sublime other, nature, and they're both in our imagination, and they come to the fore whenever we want them. And I suggested a different nature, a nature occupied by people, a nature that was sort of a co-production of what they thought was nature and human culture. and it's radically, radically different. And we'll come back, we're gonna come back, and that's gonna lead right to those important questions. And here they are. And I'm gonna try to convince you of this first one. This is a factual question. Did indigenous peoples around the world change vegetation and the ecology of landscapes using fire? I'm gonna try to convince you of that. I may not be able to convince you, but I hope to at least get a serious doubt in your mind that this might be true. And if I can place that doubt in your mind, it leads to this second question, which isn't a factual question at all, but a most important question in conservation today. Does that make the world they lived in unnatural? You see, that's a hard question to answer. A lot of people try to avoid that question, but when I talk about ecological restoration, not so much to the people that practice it at work, but people I meet through church or just through just associations here in the neighborhood, and I mention something about ecological restoration and native peoples and burning landscapes, they look at me and they say, well, then it wasn't natural. And to them, that's really important. So it ought to be important to us. Does that make the world unnatural? Because that really leads to the last question is, what are we supposed to do as conservationists? Do we just ditch the word natural? Or does it remain important? And if it is important, how do we deal with it as we think about what we're supposed to be doing as conservationists? So let's look at the cultural use of fire and ask this first question. And we're going to look all over the world, a number of different places in Europe, North America, South America, Africa, Madagascar, Australia, China, New Zealand, Northern, Southern Hemisphere. We're going to look at places that you didn't know were burning, but they were. This is England, merry old England, a place where we are told it rains all the time. And of course, fire wouldn't have been important. And yet when they look at the records of pollen and charcoal and non-pollen paleonomorphs, I suppose includes things like macrofossils, like seeds and things you find in sediments. They rebuild that landscape and they say the disturbances probably resulted from human activity, suggesting that fire was an integral part of late Mesolithic ecology. So even in England, at about the same time that fire was an important part of the ecology in North America, it was important in what's now the British Isles. Here is an example from southern Norway, again, talking about Mesolithic peoples. Hunter-gatherers in the Mesolithic used fire management, and fire was an important part of cultural practices. Burning may have been central to the hunting and gathering practices and the key to many social and cultural activities. Let's look at Italy. Back in the Greco-Roman period, going back as far as 6500 BC, we find slash and burn agriculture. This is not, the case I'm making is that fire was a part of human culture, and the use of fire to change landscapes was a pervasive practice all over the world. Let's look at Africa. Here's West Africa. We conclude that the regularity of annual fire regime in West Africa is a human ecological phenomena. And we argue that anthropogenic burning regime serves to buffer the savanna and maintain its ecological stability. My goodness, that could be me talking about oak savannas in the Chicago area. How about Madagascar? Occupied relatively recently by humans. A marked rise in charcoal is followed by a decline in the pollen of woody taxa, culminating in a change to grass-dominated pollen within 4 centuries. All this is approximately contemporaneous with the dates for extinction of megafauna, meaning large animals, and the earliest states of human occupation. So when people got to Madagascar, they started changing the landscape dramatically. China, about 7,000 years ago, again, they're calling the Neolithic in China, so they're already into agriculture by 7,000 years ago and using fire as a part of rice cultivation. New Zealand, Polynesians arrived there only 750 years ago, but that's contemporaneous with a dramatic loss in forests and conversion of nearly half of the native forest to open vegetation. The transformation, termed the initial burning period, is documented in pollen and charcoal records. So the Polynesians immediately made huge changes in the landscape of New Zealand upon arrival. Australia, which was in the news big time this last our winter, their summer, wildfires out of control over so many places in Australia. And if you were looking closely at the news, you saw many articles bringing out the Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal economies and their use of fire, and how their knowledge of fire hadn't been heeded very well by the European Australian cultures there. These are human cultures that are, I think, about 40,000 years old. The Aboriginal burning played a central role in the maintenance of landscapes subsequently colonized by Europeans. Back in the Americas, again in South America, in Brazil, the savannas, called cerrado, form of management, used fire as a form of management for thousands of years. Results indicate that the Carajo, the Indian peoples, burned for a variety of reasons throughout the dry season, thereby creating a mosaic of burned and unburned patches. So again, a fire landscape, fire people and a fire landscape. Now we go to the Americas. Let me back up for a second. If you haven't, you don't know of Robin Kimmer, you might Google that name and find out a very good writer. Both an ecologist, an academically trained ecologist, and a member of the Potawatomi Nation. I love this quote: "Every landscape reflects the history and culture of the people who inhabit it." I mean, that makes common sense to her, and yet that wouldn't have made common sense to you probably 20 or 30 years ago, before you heard about, at least before you heard about ecological restoration. It may make no sense to you today. But people have always changed the landscapes around them. The worldview of a society is often written more truthfully on the land than it is in its documents. And the current North American landscape represents a historical legacy of one worldview superimposed on another. A very different way of looking at the world. So here we can go back to the initial human invasion, occupation of North America, called the Clovis people, who spread rapidly across North and South America. I think the confirmed dates are around 12,000 years ago. The abrupt appearance of humans, disappearance of mega herbivores like mammoths and mastodons and others, and resulting changes in New World fire systems were transformative events. Fire is a mechanism by which small human populations can have broad impacts. We lose track of that because we have so many other ways to change land today. We have fossil fuel powered tractors and bulldozers, and we build houses on land, and we do all sorts of things with land without setting fires. But for people 5,000 years ago, there were no other sources of energy other than the energy stored in the vegetation on land, which you could release with fire and start shaping the world around you. In the karst, or the Barrens area of Kentucky and Tennessee, we concluded that big barrens came into existence as a result of burning forests by Native Americans in pre-European settlement times. That's 1994. Here's in the Missouri Ozarks, a place where I vacationed a few years ago. Fire helped shape the structure and species composition of hardwood forests in eastern United States over the past 14,000 years. Periodic fires led to the proliferation of fire resilient, or we might call them fire resistant species like oaks and pines, and without fire, fire sensitive species successfully outcompete those oaks and pines. Missouri Ozarks, again, here looking at actual fire return times, doing some burn scar records, fire frequencies between 1740 and 1850, a mean return time of just 2.8 years. So during a period of at least some Native American influence. Fire return times around 3 years. When it's occupied by Anglo-Americans, that increases tenfold. So let's come back to those questions again. Did indigenous peoples around the world change vegetation and ecology of landscapes using fire? Well, I hope if I haven't convinced you, I hope I've given you some serious doubt about that, and that indigenous peoples probably did have quite an influence. Does that make the world unnatural? Now, I contend that's an important question, and that leads to the next one. Well, let's look at the National Park Service. This is their 1988 policy, quoted by Stephenson in 1999. Stephenson says, given this need to restore natural conditions in the sequoia groves, we'll come back to this study later in the presentation today, natural conditions, what is a reasonable interpretation of natural? Is it the condition that would exist if the dominant Euro-American culture had never arrived, and therefore only Native American culture's influence accepted, or is it the condition that would exist in the absence of all human influence? And they say a literal reading might support the Native American influence, but the policy really doesn't explicitly address the role of Native Americans. And well, that was as of 1999, I just looked on the NPS website yesterday. This is what they have to say about fire. Fire is as a cycle in ecosystems. It improves habitat for wildlife. With fire suppression, fire is removed from that cycle and ecosystems begin to get out of balance. Well, out of balance, along with land health, to me are two of the most nice sounding but completely vague and ambiguous expressions. And this quote really, again, dodges the influence of fire. Places like Yellowstone, which we'll look at a little bit later in the presentation today, were inhabited by people for well over 10,000 years, and their fires were essential to creating and maintaining that landscape. And the Park Service still does not explicitly recognize that and leaves the word natural ambiguous. So this remains an issue in conservation today. Well, let's look at three approaches to conservation. If we really accept that indigenous American influences were a part of what we call nature, then how we react is that we restore patterns, processes, species of the world before us that was inhabited by those Native Americans, knowing all the while it was a human landscape. And we commonly call that ecological restoration. But if we decide that we exclude all intentional human influences, then the things we think of as bad today become good. And things that form without any human intentions, like buckthorn thickets and teasel meadows and honeysuckle and thistle meadows, all of those become good because that wasn't the intention of people to make it. And if you think I'm not, that I'm making this up, no, there is an approach called the novel ecosystem approach. It is supported by important people in conservation, and it is a distinct alternative to the approach of ecological restoration. And it all hinges on whether you think human intention disqualifies something as nature. Or if you think that the goal of conservation is to create a world that existed before human influence, well, then you're into what we call rewilding. And I know that word rewilding is such a cool word, and it's starting to be used to refer to almost anything. But as it was originally used, it really referred to, and again, I'm not making this up, there are some very important conservationists who have suggested taking some very large areas that include parts of many states, that sort of large area, and introducing African elephants and lions and cheetahs, because these would be proxies for the animals that became extinct with human occupation in North America, like mammoths and mastodons and American lions, which are very closely related to African lions, and American cheetahs. And so what they're doing is to rebuild a system, or at least to rebuild the trophic structure of a system that existed before people. So they take the idea of human influence very seriously and think that conservation really should be aimed at a world before human influence and not to deal with the Holocene or the last 10,000 years of the landscape that was greatly influenced by people. So these are important questions. So I lost her in my notes. Just give me a second. So I hope I've convinced you that we're all the descendants of fire people. This wasn't unique to North American indigenous peoples. Rather, it was a worldwide pattern in practice all over the world. And if we accept that, then we're that they lived in a very different nature than we live in today, a very different conception of nature. And these were really very different people than we are today, which means that when we look at those people and we try to give them roles as ecologists or benevolent nature folk or brutes or savages or proto-capitalists, all of which is commonly done in looking at indigenous people, we're making a mistake. These are really very different people, thought of themselves in fundamentally different ways than ourselves today. When we try to use those modern categories, we're really just projecting ourselves on those like the fact that this is human nature. We're really not learning anything about the past, in this case about human cultures in the past and how they related to fire and the landscapes around them. So the operative question really is, what can we learn about them and about us? Well, the next journey in our presentation today is it should be a bit more familiar because it's a journey into the fairly recent past of our own country, to visit with people and institutions that shape the world of conservation today. Fire, again, is a central character in that narrative, in relationship to which everyone defines and redefines their identity. So let's look at some, when I say modern history, I'm really talking about European American history of North America. I'm going to lean heavily on some work that was done in the Southeast because managed fire is history of managed fire, modern managed fire is oldest in the Southeast, and Cynthia Fowler and Evelyn Knopick did a wonderful story, The History of Fire in the Southeastern United States, that goes through, we've already talked about prehistory and native peoples. We're going to talk just a little bit about early European settlement. That's a tough one because there's not a lot of papers done in the farming era. That tends to be a black hole in ecology, unfortunately, because that's a hugely important era in shaping the landscapes we live in today. Then the industrial period, fire suppression period, fire management, and I added the sixth one, ecological restoration, because I think it's really a fundamental shift in our relationship to fire once again. If we look at that transition between Native American and early European settlers, the use of fire by settlers sort of mimicked that of Native Americans, not as frequently and not as extensively, but they still use fires to shape the landscape around them, to prepare, to green up fields, to burn off dead vegetation, to green up fields for grazing animals, to clear land or in slash and burn agriculture and for other purposes. So fires were a part of that very early European contact with North America. Even back in the Spanish days, farmers or Spanish occupation of the southern part of North America, they were using fire to get rid of old wild grass and encourage good forage for their cattle. But by the mid-19th century, we have a very different interaction with the forests of North America. And the industrial logging era really starts in the middle of the 19th century in the South. The southern pine forests are stripped first. Industrial logging moves into the lake states. By the last decades of the 19th century, where I worked in the Huron Mountains of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, was logged with most of its white pines in the 1890s. And industrial logging in those days was not, that we tend to use the word clear cut to refer to bad logging today, but clear cutting is not what was happening then. What they were doing more typically called hydrating. They just went through and cut the trees they wanted, the biggest trees, the most valuable trees, and they knocked over the rest or cut them down just to get them out of the way, but then they left everything behind. The tops of the trees they had felled and removed the bole for timber, tops, just everything was left behind. And so you created this huge fire hazard. And what that created was, in place of that Native American period of low intensity ground fires, we now had high intensity stand replacing fires with all those tops and brush burning at once. And we created huge fires like the Vegetational fire in Wisconsin that covered 2,400 square miles. That's about twice the size of the Yellowstone fire we'll talk about in a few minutes in Yellowstone National Park in 1988, a long time ago for some of you, not for me. I was working in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that summer, a very hot, dry summer all over much of North America. We'll talk about that later, but this fire was over twice the size and killed 1,100 people. So it was incidents like this in the middle, toward the end of the 19th century, that really turned the tide and made people think that fire was something that needed to be controlled. And this is where we enter the era of fire suppression, and in particular the U.S. Forest Service, and a man named Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief of the Forest Service. So by the 1890s, he began to define the Forest Service as an anti-fire agency. Some of you who are a little older than maybe 40 or 50 years remember Smokey the Bear on the commercials on television during the summertime when people were going out camping. That's one of the legacies of the fire suppression era. So the Forest Service, by 1910, had taken up a total fire suppression policy, just because of huge fires like the big blow up in Montana, Idaho, and Washington, covering 3 million acres. So these fires really stimulated a total anti-fire fire suppression policy, and even came out against things we now endorse to control fires, like light burning, burning off pastures, the understory of woods, burning up fuels before they accumulate and become hazardous. Even though some farmers and ranchers were advocating those, the Forest Service came out against them and prevented all burning.
Excuse me, Tom.
Excuse me? Yeah, go ahead.
This is Paul. Jackie has asked me to monitor the chat line. Her internet connection is not doing well today. So there was a question from Ginny that came in just a little while ago. I saw it pop up, but didn't interrupt again. Her question or comment, I suppose it is could it be the matter of degree of indigenous peoples' influence versus post-industrial culture and colonization? Colonizers all over the world did not understand balance and respect for nature. Their underlying belief systems did not include the need for balance and respect for nature. So that goes back to, I think, to your discussion on the indigenous influence.
Yeah, well, I think I used to say there were ecological revolutions in the history of the Chicago area, and one of them was the recession of the glacier. The next one was the warm climate era, starting about 11,000 years ago. You see which went along with the invasion of North America by humans and the beginning of the sort of fire ecology of North America. And the next one is European American settlement, which just dramatically changed the human relationship to the landscape. And we'll talk much more about this in a few minutes. Without any real recognition of the relationship of people to land before that. You could say it was a lack of respect, and it was, but it became a sort of an ignorance of what had come before us as we move forward. So we'll come back to that idea later. Thank you for that comment, Virginia. So Forest Service by the 30s had really taken in a complete fire suppression policy. They had begun to introduce things like airplanes and smoke jumpers. We'll talk a little bit more about smoke jumpers when we talk about the Man Gulch fire here in a few minutes. And fire suppression chemicals, they could fight fires anywhere, and they did. So, you know, by the 30s, that total fire suppression policy became a central objective of when they created Great Smoky Mountains National Park there. What you found was that before they made it a park, it had a 10 to 40 year fire return time, even just with you know, European American residents and fires getting away here and there. After, or excuse me, 10 to 40 year fire return time, yeah, from settlement up to 1940, and a 2,000 year fire return time after that. So that was a 200-fold increase in fire return times with that fire policy. That has to make a huge change in the vegetation of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So here's the Man Gulch fire. Now I'm going to take you through this. This is we'll talk a little bit about fire behavior, but this is a part of the fire suppression era. It was a huge tragedy that rocked the Forest Service at the time and caused them to reassess some of their policies of how they went about fighting fires. This is August 1949. Noon, the wind is blowing 6 to 8 miles an hour from the east. By 3:30, a few hours later, it shifted to the south at 24 miles an hour. By 4 o'clock, noon is when the fire was reported, excuse me. By 4 o'clock, the smoke jumpers have landed about 1.5 miles north of the fire. Now, this is Man Gulch right here. You're looking at Man Gulch, you're out in the Missouri River. So you're looking north, and so the fire is up on a ridge over in this area, over to the right of this little picture. It's up on top of a ridge. The firefighters land way back in Man Gulch, about 1.5 miles away, and they're at a lower elevation, and they know where the fire is. They were told where it was before they landed. They could see it from the airplane, and they're not concerned because the fire is high, and they're pretty far away, and they're lower. Fire doesn't go down very quickly. So they feel like they're in a pretty good position. But things start to change. The wind changes to the south. With the south wind, they realize that they don't want to get up on this ridge and approach the fire from the north. That would be not a smart thing. And so they start coming toward us in Man Gulch, moving south toward the river, knowing that the fire is up on top of the adjacent ridge and that they're in a safe position. What they want to do is get on the south side of the fire to approach it from the upwind side where the fire is and smoke is going away from them. It's a smart decision. But all the time they're doing this, the wind is picking up, and as they get near the river, they realize that spot fires have ignited the fuel down in the gulch ahead of them. Now they're in trouble because the wind is pushing the fire right at them, and they turn around and start going backwards. Within a few minutes, they're running as fast as they can. A few minutes later, they know where they dropped the tools because the tools were left behind when the fire passed. This all happens in 10 minutes. The fire leader, the crew leader that day, stops and starts a little fire. And this is the first time this was ever done. He starts a little fire and calls out to his crew to get in the black spot after it burns. He's creating an escape fire, but that had never been done before. The crew doesn't understand what he's doing. 13 of the crew continue to run north away from the fire. 2 of them go straight up this hill to try to reach the ridge. It's much harder, but it's much shorter. The 2 people that run up the hill escape, but the 13 who go down the valley are caught by the fire and killed. The crew leader survives, the first time an escape fire was ever used successfully. You can read about that on the internet, but even better, you can read this book. This is a wonderful book written by Norman MacLean. There was a movie out probably, well, it's probably 25 years ago now. I don't know, it was back in the 90s, Young Men in Fire. Here is the book. It is a wonderful book to read. It is both the dramatic story of this incident, and it's also, Norman MacLean stops along the way numerous times to talk to people about fire, about the management of fire, about fire behavior. It's a wonderful book to learn about fire, and a wonderful, sad book about the tragedy that happens in Man Gulch. So fire suppression effects, as you might expect, increasing the return time between fires by 50 or 100 times has a dramatic effect on vegetation, and places that were formerly open and sunny begin growing in with woody plants and become shady. Plants that are fire dependent, like that need fire for reproduction, like pines, stop reproducing. The establishment of oaks had formerly been facilitated by Native American fire all over North America, possibly for thousands of years. That stops. So then we enter by the middle, this is a fuzzy boundary because this starts at different times in different places, but the first prescribed fires are all the way back in the 1930s, but it really doesn't start to become at all a widespread practice until after World War II. Practice on a few federal reservations like Osceola National Forest. Here we have Okefenokee Swamp in the 1970s. It's really in the 60s and 70s that prescribed fire becomes a really common management tool, particularly in the Southeast where it's used for weeding pine plantations. When I was down in the South at Auburn, the area would just be covered in smoke. You could burn all through the winter there because there was very little snow. Any day where it dried out enough, they could burn in pine plantations. So on a good burn day, there was a smell of smoke in the air very commonly. So the Yellowstone fire happens during this fire management era, really into the era of ecological restoration. So the Fire Service, or the National Park Service, by this time has what's called a let it burn policy. Remember, I mentioned their policy about that said natural conditions. Well, let it burn policy said that if a fire was started by lightning, you let it burn. If it was started by people, you put it out. So there's a sort of implicit interpretation of that rule, meaning that if people start fires, it's wrong, and if lightning starts them, it's okay. And so several lightning-started fires became evident in June and July of that year. '88 was a very hot, dry summer, but July is expected to be wet, and so they really weren't concerned. But July continues to be hot and dry. The fires continue to build and spread, and by July 21st, the park decides to try to suppress the fires. But it's a bit late. By June into mid-August, the fires continue to expand and grow. August 20th, Black Saturday, the fires double in size to almost 500,000 acres. Residents of nearby towns are evacuated, and finally relief on the 10th with rain and snow. Now, I mention this because this is a hugely important episode in the history of prescribed fire or managed fire in North America, because this was all over the news in 1988. It was a huge black eye for the National Park Service. It was reported on the news as a catastrophe, a huge mistake on the part of the Park Service, the National Park Service, that our crown jewel of our national parks was burning up and would be scarred for decades to come. But it turns out that Yellowstone National Park was a fire ecosystem for 10,000 years. It was occupied by people who used fire for 10,000 years. The landscape responded. Lodgepole pine, which was much of the forest that burned, as you can see, reproduced abundantly after the fires. Meadows turned multicolored with wildflowers. Within a couple of years, you started to see these stories come into the news that, after all, Yellowstone wasn't dead and black. It had come to life again. But nevertheless, that event, that fire, was hugely important to the Park Service in really teaching them about managing the message, probably more than anything. The Let It Burn policy continued with some modifications after that. Ecological restoration, to me, represents a really quantum leap forward, because it means that we're not just using fire to manage weeds and pine plantations, we're now using to restore ecosystems. And it was first tried all the way back in the 40s, back in the UW-Madison Arboretum, but that's really a small sort of academic exercise. It really doesn't come into widespread use into the 80s and 90s. The Conservation District being among those agencies that have embraced the use of fire. We've done many hundreds of fires and tens of thousands of acres of fire over the last 30 years. In Glacial Park alone, we have areas that have been burned 17 times over the last 33 years. I have a picture of it here. I've been doing some research, and our Cindy Rendell, our GIS person, generated this map for. This is the most frequently burned areas, less frequently burned, somewhat less frequently burned. So you can see we've been using fire at different frequencies in Glacial Park and really conservation areas all over the county now for decades as a part of ecological restoration. Also, Grand Canyon National Park. Everyone's starting to get into the act because they realize that if you don't, bad things happen. So before it became a park, before European American settlement, the stocking of trees was 45 to 90 trees per acre, and by the time they get to the end of the fire suppression era, it's 600 to 900 trees per acre. So a tenfold increase in densities, lots more fuel on the ground, and so fires become much more difficult to manage. The sequoia groves, which I mentioned Nathan Stephenson earlier. Again, the Park Service just says natural conditions. What they have done is to go in and start using prescribed fire to recreate some of these open savanna conditions which the sequoias occurred in prior to European American settlement. The problem with this, I mean, people like forests, so what's wrong with that? Well, the problem is that if you have a fire, fire can go up this, and you now have a ladder of fuels that takes the fire up into the crowns of sequoia and kills them. So the Park Service realized that even just for the practical aspect of saving those old trees, they had to open up the stands again. So we're going to look really quickly at the history of science and fire, because this is important to me because I'm a scientist. I've trained in ecology. That's my science. And yet, when you look at the history of science and ecology, you find it's a rather odd history. And science isn't really helping us understand the role of Native Americans in fire. Rather, it starts off by covering it up. Henry Cole's very famous early ecologist never mentioned fire only once in his paper on the sand dunes of Lake Michigan, even though the black oak savannas there are fire ecosystems. Later in his Plant Societies of the Chicago area, he treats white oak woods as sort of timeless forest and doesn't understand them as fire ecosystems, which we do today. And all of this really comes from this sort of mega process called plant succession, and its main architect is Frederick Clements, because he says that habitat, or the physical environment and population, or the vegetation, act and react on one another as cause and effect until they reach a stage of equilibrium. I mean, that's really under the control of climate. Climate is the control of vegetation. Fire is just an incidental occurrence. No mention of fire or indigenous peoples as causal agents. 30 years later, again, no mention of fire or indigenous peoples as causal agents as he discusses how the vegetation of North America changes over time. And this is odd because there were all sorts of accounts coming out of the 19th century where people saw what was happening. Here, fire. Indians probably had fired the prairies as early as they could do for hunting purposes. It was sometime in later September. We began to see the advancing fires toward evening on the prairie, 3 miles west of us, on and on. Numerous accounts that talked about not only fires, but Native Americans' use of fires, and yet that had been totally marginalized with the evolution of, or the development of plant ecology as a science in the 1890s and well into the 20th century. Fire and Native American influence were marginalized and pretty much forgotten. Even in ecosystems that we now know are absolutely fire dependent like prairies. John Weaver, in an extremely important book in the middle of the 20th century, said that prairie, indeed the entire North American grassland, consisted of a climax vegetation controlled by climate. Again, no mention of fire indigenous peoples as causal agents. Yes, he taught fire prairies burn, but it wasn't important. They would have been prairies anyway. And likewise, he mentions here again primitive man and fire, but he says the pattern of grassland at the time of white settlement was dictated by the master hand of climate. Again, fire and Native Americans are marginalized as decisive causal influences. Now, there were other voices. Henry Gleason, early ecologist and then very famous botanist, quoted some of those early reports and talked about fire as an important, and John Curtis, using many of the same sources, again talks about it in his 1959 book, Vegetation of Wisconsin, but it never really takes hold at the center of plant ecology. And so really for up through the mid 20th century, we really looked at vegetation as having a natural tendency to develop to a stable form under the influence of climate, and that was simply the dominant theory, called the theory of succession. Fire was retrogressive, it set back succession, but it really didn't determine where it was going or where most of the vegetation would end up. Fire was at best a marginal influence, and indigenous peoples were completely ignored as important ecological agents of change. So what are we supposed to do as conservationists? Or lingering questions. Why do we have forest preserve districts when 2/3 of the area was covered in prairie? Why were we managing for oak forests when the public land survey, which was available to anyone back in the teens of the 20th century when the first forest preserves were created? Why did we ignore the accounts of prairies and open oak savannas? Why did we wait for 50 or 70 years after starting those forest preserves before we introduced prescribed fire? And why was there no alarm at the closing in of woods and the loss of ground floor and the disappearance of the prairies that didn't get included in those areas? Those are all very important questions we need to ask ourselves. So just to review, and then we'll stop for a little intermission here. The influence of fire. We talked about the influence of fire, that it was really a decisive influence on the vegetation of much of North America. And it was a pervasive influence of native peoples on landscapes they occupied all over the world. How the industrial exploitation of forests led to massive wildfires. How this led to the fire suppression era. How the fire suppression era was, I mean, it's not that there wasn't anything accomplished and we didn't learn a lot about fire control, but it was an ecological disaster for really natural areas and vegetation all over North America. That led to the fire to the use of managed fire in the post-war era, which spread rapidly in the 60s and 70s, and really to the ecological restoration movement of the 80s and 90s, where we start using fire, start understanding fire as an essential part of how ecosystems work, and use it to restore prairies and oak savannas in the Chicago area, to restore longleaf pine savannas in the southeastern United States, and other natural vegetation all over North America. And science, though it had a rough start, has caught up. While it did ignore the importance of fire in native peoples across North America, it has caught up and is now doing a very good job of informing us about the importance of fire to the ecology of landscapes all over North America. And with that, we'll take a little intermission now. We can certainly ask questions if you have any. I know we went over a lot of material, but yeah, any questions that you have, just shoot. Or
Well, this is
Hey, Tom,
Paul.
can you hear me?
Oh,
yeah, I can hear you.
Is my sound working now?
Well, you sound like yourself, so I guess it's working.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. I think I figured out sound enough to start managing the chat again, but thank you for stepping up and taking those questions for people. So we are going to have a 10-minute break, so we'll figure how about 11:05 for our startup time. If you need to use the restroom, you're welcome to step away and come back. We got a couple of questions in the chat for you, Tom.
Okay.
So what are the primary criteria for frequency of prescribed burns in different areas?
It's a good question, and I think partly that's an open question. We don't know, and I don't think we will know for many decades what are the frequencies of fires we should be using in prairies and oak savannas that is conducive not only for the vegetation, but for the bird community, for the insect community, for all the things that live there. We're and there's a conversation going on, and so I think we tend to manage prairies on, you know, a 2 or 3 year fire return time. Some people will burn them on a 1 or 2 year return time, and oak savannas tend to be probably 3 to 5 year fire return times. Part of that is by design, and part of it is simply the fact that once you having managed or run fires for a number of years, not anymore in Glacial Park, you put something on the burn list and it's often 2 years before you can get to it. So I put it on the burn list after 2 years and I get to it after 3 or 4. So there's no real hard and fast criteria. In general, we burn grasslands more than we burn oak savannas. My ballpark estimates for pre-European settlement, I'll toss them out there, but I don't know. I would say prairies burned at least every 1 to 2, at most 3 years. And there may have been larger gaps in that, but as a general practice, I think they'll burn very often. And oak savannas probably in that 3 to 5 and 6 year intervals. But we don't have a time machine. We can't go back. So we don't know. But a good question.
Had another question. Could you put up the review slide again?
Okay.
And another one said, why are the forest preserves called forest preserves when 2/3 are covered by prairies?
Well, it's 2/3 of the Chicago area was covered by prairies. What they did when they created the forest preserves was to aim them at the remaining woodlands. It's not, since their intention was to preserve the woodlands. And my question is, why wasn't their intention to preserve the prairies? Now, sometimes some prairies got included in those early forest preserves. Certainly, we very aggressively include any remnant prairies in conservation areas today. I'm talking about in the early decades of the 20th century. The concerted effort was toward forest. And I mentioned Henry Coles, the ecologist. I did a lot of reading of Henry Coles a couple of years ago, doing a little project that involved actually playing Henry Coles in a little play. And so I was reading everything I could read on Henry Coles, and I remember coming across where he talks about the phenomena of these little prairie patches disappearing and growing up in trees. And he said, well, that's not a problem because that's what happens. That's the process of succession. It's developing to a higher vegetational form. That sort of attitude, I think, was why we didn't aim our conservation areas and forest preserves at prairies back then. We aimed them at the trees and really managed them for the trees and largely ignored the prairie patches for a long time.
They had a comment that, yes, Young Men in Fire was a wonderful book. I agree.
Yeah. Oh, it's, he's a great author, so reading it is a treat.
Question, could you comment on the influence of organizations such as Open Lands in preservation of lands?
Well, I don't know a lot about their fire policy. I mean, most any conservation agency that I know of in the Chicago area today that does more than purchase, but also holds land and manages it is using prescribed fire today. It has been accepted universally as an important tool in managing natural areas today in the Chicago region. It's not really true all over the country. Where ecological restoration is far ahead of, we're far ahead of much of the rest of the country here, but it's a sort of, I think it's accepted now. They may differ in the frequencies of fires, but they use fire in their management of natural vegetation.
I've attended a few presentations on land trusts in general and their strategies for acquiring land. And I thought it was interesting, related to your question, that their initial strategy was to, find land and purchase it so that it could be transferred over to the agency, not necessarily holding it as long, but as funding has become more restricted and agencies are taking a little bit longer to be able to purchase that land and make it part of our conservation areas or forest preserves, wherever it may be, that land trusts are getting more interested in managing the lands for longer periods of time. We had a question, was Tom involved in the recent burn at Alden Gap?
No, I wasn't. Wasn't there. I think was that this spring.
No, it's got to be within the last 3 months.
Okay, well, I was already in my COVID-19 hole in the ground by the time that happened.
Yeah, I just
We
passed.
had a really abbreviated burn season this year.
The only reason I mentioned is that we had done, a number of seed picking events in that area, and it was, gorgeous, the flora that was there. So I hope it comes back.
Oh yeah, oh it will.
If anybody has other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Got about a minute left before we start up again. There's one last question. Is there any concerns of burn frequencies with the apparent loss of insect populations?
That has been a concern of the ecological restoration community for 30 years, and I think Ron Panzer done a lot of work on that, published some papers probably over 20 years ago now, suggested that in his experience that about a 3-year fire return time of dividing a prairie into 3 bits and burning a third at a time was sufficient to allow the insect community to rebound fully between fires. So we yeah, it's an ongoing issue. I mean, that's why I think I said this earlier. We're still learning about ecological restoration. We don't know how to do it yet, and we probably won't know in 50 years. Frankly, it will take a long time of managing these ecosystems and studying them to really learn how they work and how we need to interact with them. But we're certainly aware of the issue with insects, and we're monitoring that as we do our fires.
All right, it's 11:05, so let's go ahead and continue.
Okay. Just a second here. Investigating, the past has a built-in problem, is that we can't go there. I mean, I can't. No matter how many times I try to get my time machine in the budget at work, they never give me one. So I can't go back. I can't directly test any conjecture I have about how often savannas use safari in a pre-urban settlement landscape. I can only think about it. I can look in the literature for people that have studied it, but I can't go back and actually directly observe it. And I know I've criticized succession as plant succession is a big scale model that says that all vegetation everywhere, there's this process that governs its development, and I'm quite critical of that, because I think it's led to a lot of misunderstandings of history and time and change, and led to the just bad conservation decisions. But I'm going to introduce a few models now, smaller scale models that for me are important to understanding fire and how we use it in the landscape today. So one of the things we forget is that fire kills things. Fire kills plants and animals. That is its ecological effect, the after effects of killing plants and animals. Fire is hot, and it kills things. We can sort of try to romanticize it sometimes, but that's how it has its effect. But it discriminates between more and less vulnerable species. So oaks are much less vulnerable to fire than are elms. And so if you burn a woods that contains oaks and elms, the elms decrease in population and the oaks maintain themselves and perhaps even increase. Fires can create a mineral soil seedbed, which are opportunities for seeds to germinate. That's particularly important, when I was studying northern landscapes with hemlock in them. Those little hemlock seeds need bare mineral soil, so a fire under an adjacent stand of hardwoods would bear the mineral soil, the hemlock seeds would fall on it, and they would reproduce abundantly, and that would become a hemlock forest. So another important effect of fire, it increases sunlight intensity at the ground surface. Why? Because it kills things. Because it kills small plants shrubs, small trees. It kills those and allows sun to reach the ground surface. And it also volatilizes some nitrogen and releases basic nutrients. So probably not terribly important to our discussion today, but if you go to the Indiana dunes where you have a sandy soil and look at an area where it's been burned, the pH jumps up a little bit because the calcium and potassium, and they're released in the ash after a fire. It's temporary, but it pumps the pH up just a little bit, then it drops with acid leaching from rainwater in succeeding years.
Hey, Tom, we got a question in the chat.
Okay, go ahead.
Fire supports ecological restoration, but doesn't it also increase some invasive species growth? How do you balance this?
Well, fire can do a lot of things, and we have to, fire can invite in things like sweet clover. That's because sweet clover is a fire species from the old world. Because fires burned all over the world, not just here. And so fire species exist in many parts of the world. And when they become weeds, they're a problem. So obviously, all of these management decisions, we have to look at all the factors. We used to burn off brome grass areas just to keep out woody invasion. Well, all we did when we did that, we invited in sweet clover. So we're creating these huge sweet clover fields. So what we stopped burning the brome grass fields, and now we include them in our ecological, what do we call it? Ecological, I can't remember the catchy title, but it's where we cut them for hay. We lease them out. We have people cut them for hay. That doesn't invite sweet clover. So we do change our management to try to reduce those weeds that exploit fire. Ultimately, if you don't burn a prairie, you don't end up with a prairie. And so you have to, so we have to deal with some weeds after the fact. If they exploit the fire, we have to go in. If it's important, we have to go in and deal with them after they come in. So what I want to talk about now is fire as a mediator. Fire affects some things more than others. So when we burn a landscape, maples is just an example, sugar maple, an example of a fire-sensitive woody plant, meaning woody plants keep a permanent part above ground so they can be injured by a fire. Herbaceous plants, the perennial plant is below ground, so they're not injured by fire. Maple is a weak root collar sprouter, so if you kill the top, it may not re-sprout. It has thin bark, so it's easily injured by fire. And the seeds germinate and lift their little seed leaves above the ground. If you've ever planted beans in a garden, you know what an epigeous germination is. It lifts those little seed, the food storage leaves above ground, and those can be nipped off by a fire. So maples are very sensitive to fire. Oaks, as a group, are woody plants, so they're still somewhat sensitive to fire, but they're very aggressive root collar sprouters. They have very thick bark in relation to maples, so they survive fires better. The acorn stays below ground when it germinates. And so it's protected from fire. You can see the root-shoot ratio of maples. There's a lot of above ground part in relation to the below ground part. And in oaks, it's just the opposite. There's more root than there is shoot. And so if you injure the top, the bottom has a much greater capacity to resprout and create a new plant. If you're looking at prairies out in the grass, they're herbaceous, they're perennial. The fires during the dormant season really don't hurt them. And they have what's called a basal meristem, meaning that the growth point of a grass blade is not at the tip as it is in a woody plant, it's at the base of the blade. That incidentally is why you have it in your front yard. It makes great turf grass. You mow off the end of the blade, but the part that's actually growing is down at the base of the blade, and it just pushes that mowed bit out, and you can keep mowing it off without injuring the grass. Well, it works the same with fire. The fire doesn't injure the grass, it grows back quickly after the fire. So fire frequency becomes more, or the fire return time is shortened. Higher fire frequency, we push this mediation in the direction of grass. Lower fire frequencies, we push this mediation in the direction of fire-sensitive species like sugar maple. So fire in an ecosystem can be a regenerator. The plants that are already there respond aggressively and simply replace themselves after the fire goes through. That's the case in a prairie where the fire simply burns the tops off and the plants grow back immediately after the fire. So we can model that. We have an unburned vegetation, we have a fire, and then it regrows and is more or less the same as it was before. Oak woodlands, much the same. The fire really doesn't affect, it can hurt a tree, certainly, but it generally burns through without harming the trees, or at least the oak trees. It burns off the tops of the herbaceous vegetation, and that replaces itself after the fire. We can also have fire as what I call a terminator recycler. So in this case, the fire, catastrophic fire creates an unvegetated area. Just so much heat from some of these, particularly fires out west, the heat can be so intense it sterilizes the ground. You have an unvegetated area. What happens after that is that whatever is on the outside moves into the inside. So if that's a lodgepole pine forest or a white pine western white pine forest or a Douglas fir forest. It scatters seeds into that area, and it starts to turn into the same thing that surrounds it. To me, this is the model of change I use in ecology today. It fits very well what we see in the world around us. If this is surrounded by suburbia and it's full of ornamental plants and buckthorns and honeysuckle hedges, what happens is that this becomes a honeysuckle buckthorn thicket. If it's surrounded by a prairie, it becomes a prairie. It doesn't have any natural tendency to do one or the other. It just follows whatever is around it. And eventually, this area becomes like its surrounding. It becomes a buckthorn thicket like the donor areas around it, or it becomes a prairie, or it becomes a lodgepole pine forest. And then subsequently another fire somewhere down the road. And this is one of those models I have of fire influence that is a working model for me. I take it around with me in my mind. When I'm looking at, this is a glacial moraine up here. Those of you who are in the geology webinar, it's a glacial moraine. The streams tend to be entrenched in those glacial moraines, leaving at the edge of the floodplain these steep slopes. Steep slopes are hard for the fires to burn down into from above, and so we tend to have ecosystems that operate on a longer fire return time of more fire-sensitive species. Sugar maple, red oak is the more sensitive of the oaks. We have basswood mixed in there. In the general upland up here, of the rolling upland, well-drained areas of glacial moraines, often the bulk of many of what we call forest preserves or conservation areas today on glacial moraines are white oak woodlands, almost pure white oak in a pre-European settlement landscape. And then as we move toward the edges where the former prairie, near the former prairie, we see bur oak savanna. I guess I first noticed that when I was working at the Morton Arboretum in the early 90s, and I sort of developed this little model, and it's been good ever since. Now, sometimes forest preserves are land ownership patterns truncate the preserve here, and the white oak woods goes right up to the boundary. But if you look at the public land survey, try to reconstruct the old size of the grove and then look to see if any of that edge adjacent to prairie was preserved, you'll see probably that it was bur oak savanna or bur oak hills oak savanna. So this is a working model, a small scale model that helps me interpret landscapes in their relationship to fire. It's remarkable to me that Henry Coles, an extremely intelligent man, wonderful teacher, fine ecologist in so many other ways, simply didn't see this spatial juxtaposition of communities that sort of now shouts at me about the influence of fire. Theory has a powerful effect on the mind, and the theories of the time simply didn't allow him to think about that. What we're going to do now is to look at some of the ancestral relationships of well, excuse me. What we're going to do is to look at landscapes all across North America. I mean, I've made the case that the ancestral human relationship to those landscapes and fire was pivotal in that people were burning those landscapes really for much of the last 10,000 years. Well, now I want you to look at the other side of that relationship, and we're just going to take a quick tour around North America to look at some of those landscapes. Fire was not the exception. The dominant fact of forest history, I put that in there because Stephen Spur was the advisor of my advisor, sort of intellectual grandfather. And he said this in, believe the late 50s, early 60s, when fire was still not fully embraced by the plant ecology community, and he was trying to make a point. I would probably not soften that point, but diversify it a bit today to say that fire is a dominant fact of landscape history. It's one of those dominant facts. If you're working in North America, you have to be aware of fire and its historical effects, so you're probably not doing a very good job of interpreting the landscape. So I guess most of us around here know about fires and grasslands and their dependence on fire today. Again, in the middle of the 20th century, that was still controversial, but today we accept that as a given that fires were, or prairies were a fire community all over North America. There were coastal grasslands, even into New England, that are now being managed with fire, that were formerly managed by Native Americans by fire. Even out on Cape Cod, the grasslands were managed by Native Americans in fire. Swamps like the Everglades, what was called the Sea of Grass, burned periodically by Native Americans. It must have been a glorious sight to see. Okefenokee Swamp. Grass evolves in the Great Smoky Mountains. You can go back to Thomas Jefferson, who, not talking about the Great Smokies, but about Virginia, not too terribly far away, and about grassy balds in wooded areas. And he recognized that they were created by Native American burning practices. And that was in the late 18th, very early 19th century. I believe Thomas Jefferson died, into the early 19th century. And so this was common knowledge. Native American influence was common knowledge. Oak hickory forests, really through the Midwest and Mid-South, everywhere are fire systems. That doesn't mean they all burned every year, of course not. And there are different sorts of oak and hickory forests and woodlands and savannas, which operated at different fire frequencies in different places. But it means that fire was essential to their character wherever you find them. American chestnut forests, which are now gone, from the chestnut blight all through the Appalachians up into Pennsylvania, a hugely important tree to the timber industry. Tragedy with chestnut blight eliminated it. These were fire ecosystems. Go out to California. Oak savannas in California, really much like oak savannas in our part of the world, dependent on repeated fires. Indians in California burned the landscape frequently over thousands and thousands of years. Digger pine savannas in California. Digger pines are very large cones, and the seeds are actually used as food by Native Americans. Giant sequoia groves, we already talked about that. Formerly managed by Native Americans with fire, now the Park Service is starting to reintroduce fire into those ecosystems. This is a picture I took in the late 1980s in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the Huron Mountains. These are the sandy areas not far from Lake Superior. These are red pine plantations, red pine and white pine mixed together. I think it looks like there's a white pine right over the right-hand side, and a few of them mixed in. These seeds germinated after fire and created this stand of pines, and will not reproduce themselves until after the fire, until another fire goes through at some point in the future. Another spot in the Huron Mountains right along the edge of one of the inland lakes, which I suspect now were actually Native American campsites. You find these little openings in these what amount to red pine savannas. These are hemlock woods, pretty dense, dark hemlock woods adjacent to it, where the fires will just creep through in the litter. But these were these open savannas along the edges of the lake, I suspect, were maintained by Native Americans as sort of campsites. Jack pine forests right along the lake were replaced by, periodically, I think the fire scientists that have worked up there say 30 to 60 year return times on jack pine forests. The fire would just roar through here and take out all the trees, and they would be replaced by literally millions of little jack pine seedlings. Jack pines are one of those species that has serotinous cones, so that the cones, after they're formed, just sit there without opening, and so the tree for 30 years will store almost all of its seed production. The heat of the fire melts the resin, the cones pop open, and you have 30 years of seed released suddenly after a fire, and the jack pine reproduces. Longleaf pine savannas in the southern Gulf coastal plain. These were once all across the Gulf and Atlantic coastal plain, eliminated by industrial logging and replaced now by pine plantations, mostly with loblolly and slash pines, both perfectly nice trees, but they were formerly longleaf pine savannas. Longleaf pine has a grass stage. The seed germinates, it develops what for all the world looks like a tuft of grass, and it will sit there for multiple years and build up food in its root system. During that time, the fires burned through the wiregrass but the dense shock of needles surrounding the terminal bud protects the terminal bud, and then the seedling bolts and gets to 5 or 6 feet tall, high enough to get the terminal bud above the fires in just a couple of years, and at least most of those little trees can survive. So an extreme fire adaptation on longleaf pine. Table Mountain pine, the Appalachians, again, a serotinous cone glued together with resin released after the fire. Lodgepole pine, yeah, we talked about that in the 1988 Yellowstone fire, a species that's really dependent on fires to reproduce. Ponderosa pine savannas, again, mostly maintained by Native American low-intensity surface fires. Some indication in the literature that that was variable, but certainly most of them were park-like stands of pines that were allowed in many cases to grow in very thick, dense stands of trees that are very difficult to manage today because fires now are quite catastrophic in their intensity. Back to the Huron Mountains where I work, these are eastern hemlock forests. Hemlock can do a lot of things, but one of the things it does is it reproduces very aggressively after fires. If you run a light, it's very shade tolerant. So if you run a light fire through the woods, just burning off the surface litter, probably flame heights of a foot tall, what you do is create a perfect seed bed for hemlock seedlings, and those seedlings can survive in the shade of mature trees and very slowly grow upward and then be released as the older trees die. So a sort of sneaky fire species. Douglas fir in the northern Rockies is a fire species. Replaces itself after fire. Redwood forest burned by Native Americans in California for thousands of years. Pinyon pine, juniper forests throughout the Southwest, fire ecosystems. I mean, when you total them all up, you're really covering most of North America. And this it seems to surprise people who haven't studied fire and fire ecology, but it's simply a fact of the vegetation of North America that most of it were fire ecosystems, and most of it influenced decisively by the use of fire by indigenous peoples. But there were exceptions. Certainly, beech maple forests in the eastern United States thrives where there are exceedingly rare or no fires. Both beech and maple are fire-sensitive trees that reproduce well in the shady conditions of a mature forest. Basswood, again, sugar maple basswood forests in our area, while they're very small in spatial extent, were here in small amounts and thrived in those areas where fire very rarely reached. Beech magnolia forest in the southeast, exceedingly rare in their extent in a pre-European settlement landscape, but they were around, and they were exceptions to that rule of fire ecosystems. And mixed mesophytic forests in the Smoky Mountains, gorgeous forest to see if you go to the Smokies. I do wonder now, looking back on it, because I visited these forests as a young man, as a student in ecology at Auburn University. I visited the Great Smokies a couple of times, and I wonder how much those mixed mesophytic forests have changed and become more dense with fire suppression in the 20th century. But nevertheless, they're an example, at least the core of them, examples of exceptions to that rule of fire ecosystems, as are the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. High deserts, yes. Grassy deserts, no. High deserts like this, where you mostly have bare ground and cacti, obviously fires can't propagate. Grassy deserts, yes, fire was a common event in those. So what we're going to do now is to look a little bit at prescribed fires. I've probably been on more than 100 prescribed fires in the 16 years I've been with the Conservation District. Many fewer than some of my colleagues, I'll say that right up front. Some of them are far more experienced than I am, but I've seen enough to see fire do a lot of surprising, amazing, and at times frightening things. And what this has done for me, I mean, obviously I'm proud to have contributed to the efforts of the Conservation District in doing ecological restoration. But what it's done for me as an ecologist is it's given me a front row seat to watch fire. And it's fascinating to watch how on the same day you can watch fire just move rapidly across a flat prairie like the one you're looking at and not leave 1 square foot of ground unburned. And later that day, go into a rolling woodland, watch the fire just creep slowly and hesitatingly through the leaf litter and go out when it hits a log. That's just remarkable on the same day to see such radically different fire behavior. How on one day you can see just a very slight breeze comes up and you see the fire flare up and the flame heights increase 2 or 3 times in height. Or even on a day that's cloudy, the sun comes out for a few minutes and it dries the vegetation and you see the fire perk up and those flame heights increase and the fire start to move more quickly. So it's been a remarkable education for me, a practical education, in just watching fires and seeing how they move and when they don't move through natural areas. A few things I've learned about fires. The first is that I really don't like smoke. I've acquired quite a sensitivity to smoke. Being over-prepared is being prepared. Trust your colleagues. If you don't trust your colleagues, don't go on the fire. Be ready for the unexpected because something unexpected always happens. Sometimes it's very small, sometimes it's large, but be ready. For me, a boring fire was always a good fire. I didn't want excitement. I wanted boredom. I wanted to have people in the right places at the right times. And the whole fire came off and it ended when it was supposed to end. And I could call that in to the fire department. And that was a nice, boring fire. Escapes, excitement are exciting at the time, exciting a week or 2 later, but at the time they're just scary. Did I mention I really don't like smoke. That's the bottom line, my experience with fire. So let's look a little bit at prescribed fire. This gets a little exciting because we'll actually see some videos of fire. So just a few things in thinking about fire. Is that safety is first, last, and always. And what I'm not going to do here, I'll flash it up here in a minute. This is not a prescription burn training course. Don't go out and start lighting things on fire because Tom gave you a lesson in prescribed fire. Safety first, last, and always. Both the crew and the public around you. Always wear proper PPE. I mean, I sort of got into ecological restoration in 1990. And at that time, proper PPE was a pair of blue jeans and a cotton shirt. That's not proper PPE anymore. And fire training was not widely available. So we didn't know, some people didn't know what proper procedures were, but all these proper PPE procedures and training are all available now. If you want to burn a little bit of land, of your own land, learn about it first. Try to avoid a disaster. And for that matter, if you don't know how to do it, you're not likely to achieve the objective you're after. So Jackie runs some prescribed burning workshops every year. There are classes online to take. There are field days to take. Get in the know and take those courses before you go out and start lighting fires. This is not a do-it-yourself course. I don't want to go.
I'll add a quick comment there.
Okay.
If you are interested in volunteering with us as a prescribed burn crew member, shoot me an email separately and I can get you information on the kind of training that you would need for that. We also had a question in the chat. Okay. So your example of how a burned area surrounded by prairie will become prairie, but surrounded by suburbia will become full of buckthorn and such. That sounds like what happens when an agricultural field is abandoned. Is that true, or are there any differences?
No, I think that's for me is just a general model of how things change. What happens to an ag field when you abandon it is it fills in with weeds that are growing in the fence rows, which are brome grass and whole variety of annual weeds growing in and around the edges of farm fields. So even though it was a prairie 200 years ago, it can't turn back into a prairie. There's no prairie around it anymore. If you have a house nearby with buckthorn and honeysuckle growing at it, you'll find that buckthorn and honeysuckle will start sprouting up in that farm field. So whatever is around the area is what invades it. It's just a general sort of simple, it seems almost too simple to be a model, but it's just a general model of how things change. And to me, it's very useful because it tells me why we need to manage prairies and natural areas today. Why do we need to do that? It's because they're surrounded by a world that's full of invasive plants. And because if we don't manage those invasive plants, just migrate into the natural areas. There's no way, the natural areas can't stop that. And so we need to manage the natural areas because they're always going to try to change into the world around them. We're just stuck with that today until we can have 100% native plants growing around our conservation areas today. We'll need to manage them. And for that matter, we'll need to manage them even after that with fires. Maybe more of an answer than you wanted. We good?
Yeah, there was one other quick comment in the chat. I think this is Father Ginny Weir. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Said the white oaks decimated in the 19th century Appalachia due mostly to invasive insects, or did fires, mining, etc., figure into their demise?
So what was the first part of that question? There was a species.
Oh, I'm sorry. That means from Ginny. So were the white oaks decimated in 19th century Appalachia due mostly to invasive insects, or did fires, mining, and other things figure into their demise?
I don't know about that example in particular. I would suspect, I don't know of any, I mean, gypsy moths, you're talking about 19th century. I think gypsy moths were early 20th century. We're spreading.
She meant white chestnuts?
Chestnut was a disease. That was chestnut blight that eliminated that. With oaks, I suspect it was a combination of forestry practices and wildfires, high intensity fires after that, along with just cutting down oak trees to make things out of. I mean, people did that everywhere. So yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that question better without knowing more about the specifics of that area. Are we ready?
That's it. I think you're good to go.
Okay, so these are, now I haven't been leading fires in Glacial Park for a few years now, but these are just the sort of things I would have to do before a fire. I would call the local fire department, county dispatch. I didn't have to do the village municipality there because I'm far enough away from Richmond and Ringwood. I would have to call the MCD Police Administration, Lost Valley Visitor Center. There were a variety of people that I had to call in the Conservation District, County Health Department, and then a list of neighbors that wanted to know. I had a neighbor who had a pet bird that had asthma, and that's not a joke. And I would call her each time I had a fire in Glacial Park because of a bird with asthma. If you want to keep good neighbor relations, make the call. So what I wanted to do here, for those of you who have seen fires and know a little bit about it, this will be boring and old hat. For those who don't and don't understand how you can manage a fire, I just wanted to do a very, very simple little graphic here. We have an area here. This is what we're going to try to burn. So that makes this boundary our fire lines. We so happen to have a gravel path on one side and wide enough that we're not concerned about the fire escaping up. Or if we'll say this is in this direction, and we have a stream over here sufficiently wide, we're not going to worry about fire escaping in that direction. And so the wind is blowing from left to right, and the question here is, where do we start the fire? I always do this with classes when I start prescribe fire, and some of you obviously know that by now. You've been around fires, and you know that, well, if we started over here, we'll get done faster because the fire will go with the wind and it'll get across here really fast. But problem is we have neighbors on both sides, and if there's something flammable here, there's really nothing to stop the fire from going onto the neighbor's property. So we don't start it there. We start it on this side, and we call that the backfire. The fire, we say that the fire is backing into the wind. It moves slowly. The wind is actually pushing the heat of the fire back onto the burned ground and not ahead of the fire onto the unburned vegetation. The smoke and heat are going this way. The fire is moving very slowly this way. That fire is easy to control. When I light the fire, I have people here with what are called flappers or water, and we put the fire out. We probably have mowed that fire line or done something to make it easy to put that fire out, and we start to develop what's called the black line. And when that gets big enough that we think a head fire, which we'll call this the head fire, that we think the head fire won't jump it. Excuse me. Let's look at, here's an example of a backfire. You can see that the smoke is going this way. So this is a backfire. The fire is creeping from right to left in this direction. And we've got two ATVs here with water tanks on the back, and they're putting the fire out right here. A person ahead of them is lighting. So what this person does is to wait for the fire to start to spread. The fire is burning back this way, and then he waits for it to spread and then puts it out along this line. We have at least one or two people behind him to make sure it doesn't reignite, because we don't want the fire over here. This is tall vegetation and would be very hard to check if the fire jumped this line. You see here we mowed this because mowed vegetation burns more slowly, the flame heights are lower and much easier to control. Here's another case where we're doing a backfire. It doesn't look like we've got much wind at all. The smoke is just going up. We've actually got our ATVs positioned on the other, the smoke is going this way because the ATVs have positioned themselves on the hot side of the fire. Not something to do unless you know what you're doing. What they're doing is staying out of the smoke. It's really for their health and ability to see what they're doing. Obviously, if the ATV broke down there, you would have to immediately put this fire out to save the machine. That's the danger of operating on the hot side of the fire. Another backfire here, the head fire is being lit here. You see how the wind is taking the fire into the savanna now. It's a little hard to see the flame heights. You can see them there. They're pretty tall flames. A few volunteers. This was one where I was hosting a few volunteers who were watching the fire. This is one of the things we do on a prescribed fire in an oak savanna, which this was a savanna fire, is we have to go through and put out the oak trees that catch on fire. Oak trees are pretty tough. Fire doesn't generally kill them, but it will get into dead branches up above and start burning into the tree. Back when I was talking about fire ecology, the central important point is that fire kills things. And fire will kill an old tree as well as a young tree, not often, but it will scar the tree, it will get inside of the tree, open up a point of disease invasion. So when we look at the oak woods at the time of European settlement, the trees were generally smaller than they are today. The big trees anyway were smaller because they had a shorter lifespan. Fire is tough. Fire injures trees, it doesn't kill them right away, but they have a shorter lifespan. So what we're doing now is just trying to put out some of the trees that catch on fire. The head fire is lit, it's moving much faster, consuming much more fuel per unit time. The flame heights are much higher. You don't become completely a spectator, but there's really not much you can do to stop that head fire right now. And eventually the fire comes together and you have a burned over black area. Here we're looking at another graphic where we have, this is about fire control. We have a fire escapes. What we do is we go downwind of the fire, create a fire control line. In a wildfire out west, they'd use a bulldozer and then light this line and try to create a black area ahead of the fire to stop that fire. When the fire hits black, it has to go out because there's no fuel. But that black black line has to get big enough that it stops the fire from leaping over. Here's another example. Here now I'm saying we're prescribed burning over here. This was our fire line, and it seemed to be working well, but we take our eyes off of it for a minute, and this fire reignites, and we come up to it, and it looks like this. What do? Well, what we don't do is we don't go out ahead of the fire and try to stop it. That's very dangerous, and if the fire is in tall fuels and has any time to get started, it's practically impossible. What we do instead is to attack it here. Why? Because the wind is taking the heat and the smoke away from us. We can work in the black, so we're safe. It can't burn where we're standing, and we're working our way up along the sides of the fire. If we've got enough people and enough water, maybe we can move all the way up and put this fire out before it gets very far. If not, we'd have to go down and do the backfire technique to stop this wildfire. Don't ever try this by yourself. This is dangerous stuff. You really need to be with experienced people when you're fighting a fire that's out of control. Let's look at the last 5 minutes. Just look at some fire. The background noise are the machines, the pumps that are operating in these ATVs.
Hey, Rick, you run up ahead of me. There was a fence that's down
See, here we've got a head fire. Look at the smoke is right ahead of the fire.
Yep.
Flame heights are pretty high. It's burning across the marsh. Smoke is lifting well up into the air. It's always a good sign. Fire smoke that stays on the ground eventually bothers someone down there. So we want the fire to lift. We want the smoke to lift. Here's a fire sticky run. Now here, right at this moment, you can see that this looks more like a head fire, and this is not receiving as much wind behind it. But these two fires are starting to come together, and where they come together, they create an updraft and pull oxygen in, and so you see all flames right here. Now, both sides of the fire, the updraft is really kicking in, and you see both sides of the fire flaring up.
And we can probably use a flare right in here. Otherwise, this stuff's going to burn for a while back and in. If you got a flare, we could probably, if we got one right in here, it'll help get this burned off.
We always have radios on the fire. We're in constant radio communication so that we know what's happening on the other side of the fire. Sometimes these fires occur over 300 or 400 acres, and you can't even see the people on the other side of the fire, so you need that radio communication. Here's Marengo Prairie at Marengo Ridge Prairie Restoration. Fire has already passed through this area, but it's still burning. Over, now we're looking kind of to the south. The difference in flame heights depending on where the wind is really catching the fire and feeding the flames. Fire neatly put out right along the edge of the mowed area. This is our picnic area over here with the pavilion. So mowed grass like that, mostly Kentucky bluegrass, is almost inflammable, so that makes a nice fire break. Hopefully this fire will have killed most of that brush that's invading the prairie, at least killed it back to the ground. A moment ago, these flames were short. Now they've kicked up. The fire has changed directions, or the wind has changed direction, and is really feeding those flames now. Changes in the wind direction are some of the harder things to deal with on a fire, because most of your planning has to do with where is the fire going to go, how fast is it going to go there, where do I need to put my people and equipment to control it. And when wind directions change, that's generally bad news. Slight changes, that you can deal with, but when it flips around 90 degrees or 100 degrees, then often you find yourself in trouble. So yeah, fire kills things, but fire is essential to the functioning of most terrestrial ecosystems in North America. prior to European American settlement. I consider that a fact of ecological history in North America. It's not really a contentious point anymore and shouldn't be. It's simply a fact of ecological history in North America. And so whenever we're managing for ecological restoration to try to restore those plant communities and ecosystems that were resident in our areas prior to European American settlement, we need to include fire as a part of an ecological restoration strategy. Well, that's it for today. Thank you. Again, I always seem to be zipping over lots of material, but you've got some minutes to ask questions now. The PDF will be available for your more leisurely, I'll add some notes to it, your more leisurely perusal later on. But right now, any questions?
I'm gonna jump in and just do a little reminder that if you are interested in learning more about prescribed burns and volunteering with us, send me an email. Our requirements for burning with us are to be minimum of 18 years old, to take a burn class, specifically either the Chicago Wilderness Prescribed Burn Crew training or the S130-190. Those are National Wildfire Coordinating Group classes online with a field day, and to be a registered volunteer with us. We burn usually each spring and fall when there's not a pandemic, and we provide gear like the Nomex or the fire retardant clothing, helmets, gloves, glasses, that kind of thing. We are going to have some time for questions, so feel free to type them in the chat. As a heads up, we are going to be taking a break for a couple weeks from webinars. You can send us suggestions if you have any ideas in the meantime, but we're anticipating, hopefully, at least for staff, to be out in the field a little bit more, so waiting to see what our next steps are before scheduling future presentations. So with that, I will read some of the comments. So we had a moment in classical literature shared that according to Dante in the Inferno, the man and fire relationship will never end. God has scheduled prescribed burns. Fire, or the wrath of God, will slowly rain down on the violence against nature for all eternity as they endlessly run around in circles on the plain of burning sand.
Okay, well, I'm sure that's probably not the goal of prescribed fire, but yeah, well, fire is it's interesting. Once you become aware of the human relationship with fire, you start noticing it more in the literature you read, particularly if you, yeah, it's a fascinating relationship to study, and it's one that I say science got it wrong for a long time in terms of the human relationship with fire, and that's, science gets it wrong sometimes, but it does have a self-correcting mechanism, and eventually got it right. And science is doing a wonderful job today. I mean, I could have used 50 and not, I think I used about a dozen examples of indigenous peoples and their use of fire. I could have put 50 on there, and if I'd spent more time, I could have put 100. I mean, there's just wealth of research going on around the world now, documenting the relationship of indigenous peoples to fire and to the landscape. So it's a fascinating area of study.
Another question, was the Marengo Ridge Spring 2019 video burned all in one day?
That was what you saw in that picture was a one-day burn. It probably, I don't know, I mean, once you get, fires seem to take forever to get started. When you're lighting the backfires, they're creeping slowly, and you're standing in the smoke because you're, you know, on the fire line with the smoke coming right back in your face. They seem to take forever to get started, and then as you get toward the end and you light the head fire, they move with amazing rapidity. I would guess that was sort of a half-day fire that we got that one done. I think I was there. I think I was there on that day, but I
think that one was about 60 acres.
Yeah, I mean, we've burned fires. I've run fires up to 400 acres in size, and those are giants. And those always gave me a lump in my throat before we started, just because of the sheer size, the length of the burn line, the amount of time from when you start to when you end. a number of things that can happen in terms of broken equipment, weather changes. There's always, I had a lump in my throat until we were done with those. So some of them can take our all-day fires. That one was probably a few hours, the Marengo fire.
There's a comment from earlier that I think was relating to ecology kind of overlooking Indigenous people's influence. Could it be a matter of the degree of Indigenous people's influence versus post-industrial culture and colonization? Colonizers all over the world did not understand balance and respect for nature. Their underlying belief systems did not include the need for balance and respect for nature.
I think Paul read that one earlier.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Back when I was having sound issues.
Yes, back when you disappeared, yeah.
All right. Scrolling back down. Can you give us a list of the good books you recommend?
Well, I mean, the best book about, it's not really about ecological restoration, Young Men in Fire, and is a must read if you're interested in fire, because Norman MacLean actually worked on fires as a young man with the Forest Service, and so he has firsthand experience of firefighting. He comes back to investigate the Mangold Fire much later in his life. So he brings a personal edge to that. He talks to a lot of people who know about fire. It's a wonderful book to read about fire. I've learned most of my stuff about prescribed fire through prescribed fire classes over the years, 4 or 5 or 6 of them, and through doing it and watching it and working with people that know more than I do. So I don't know that I have a long list of books on fire.
I had another question about seeding this time. Do you seed prairies that are also scheduled for spring burns?
Well, you wouldn't, if you were going to burn, you would normally seed after the burn, because that creates a nice seed bed. I know an experiment I did a few years ago introducing prairie betony into a tall grass prairie. I compared different methods, and one of them was just to burn off the old prairie and to scatter the betony seeds on top. Turned out that did about as well as any of my site prep methods. So you would seed after the burn. I mean, once the seeds have germinated, you don't have to worry about, I mean, generally you don't burn the first year because there's not enough fuel to burn a prairie in the first year. You have to wait a few years before you get enough fuel to burn, but it's not as if fire would hurt the plants a year after they germinate. So yeah, if you're going to seed, you would seed after the burn, but once the seed is germinated and the plants have started to grow, your timing of burning really, you're just going to burn as soon as you can get some fuel there to burn, and then burn at whatever interval you feel is appropriate, whether it's a 2-year interval or 3, or if it's a prairie you just want to manage for wildflowers, burn it every year.
We had a question in the chat about where do I find more information on the S130 and 190 classes online. So I will put my email in the chat, and send me an email. I will make sure to include all of the information you need to know the online classes. So if you're going to do the S130 and 190, that's kind of the standard if you're going to be working for a land management agency, or if you're going to be on one of the hotshot crews out west or that kind of thing. Those 2 classes take about a week to do, and there's an in-person field day that's required after you do the online portion. The field days, I'm assuming, are all postponed for a little while here, so that scheduling may be a little interesting for now, but the other option as for our region is Chicago Wilderness has a simplified version of that meant for volunteers that's about a day. I think they may have expanded it to like 2 sessions so that the sessions are shorter. But that would be the Chicago Wilderness Prescribed Burn Crew training. That one is usually in person. We host it annually, although this year we had to cancel due to COVID. But there are other agencies in the area that also host that. Tom, any additions?
No, oh no. What I'm going to do is in the PDF. I'll put some resources in the PDF. I get so wrapped up in preparing a presentation, I don't get that step ahead. But I'll put some resources in the PDF. So just look for that. It should be available by Monday or so.
And it is 12:01. So if you have to get going, you're welcome to. If there are any more questions, we'll sit here and answer questions as long as there are any. I didn't see any new ones in the chat yet, so we'll give it a minute and go from there. All right, no new questions. So I think, Tom, if you'd like to wrap it up and stop recording when you're done.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for coming today. Those of you who are still here, it's always fun, and we'll meet again.